She was being sold at auction like cattle. A widowed father spent his last dollar to save her. But what happened next would test every belief about sacrifice, courage, and what it truly means to protect the innocent. This is the story of a moment when doing right meant risking everything, and how one man's desperate act of compassion changed three lives forever. If you believe some things are worth more than money, stay with us. This story will restore your faith in humanity. Victoria May stood on the auction platform in nothing but a torn white dress, tears streaming down her face as grown men shouted bids like she was livestock. The Red Horse Saloon reeked of whiskey and tobacco smoke, and the jeering crowd of miners and drifters had gathered for this sickening spectacle in Silver Creek, Wyoming territory. "What we have here is a genuine beauty, fresh as mountain snow," boomed Marcus Webb, the saloon owner, banging his gavel with a twisted grin. "Starting bid is $50. Victoria's hands trembled as she tried to cover herself. She'd been an orphan since 14, surviving on seamstress work until last week when Webb cornered her with an impossible debt. Her dead guardian's gambling losses that somehow became her burden. $60, shouted a gap-toothed prospector. 70, called another voice. Outside, Daniel Stone was securing his horse, planning to grab supplies before returning to his 8-year-old daughter, Lucy. He'd been a widower for 3 years, working his blacksmith shop and trying to raise his child right in an increasingly cruel world. But then he heard the shouting from inside and the crying. Daniel pushed through the batwing doors, expecting to see a card game gone wrong. Instead, his blood turned to ice as he witnessed something that would haunt him forever. There on the platform stood a girl barely older than a child, being auctioned off like cattle while men treated her suffering as entertainment. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. Memories of his dying wife flooding back. How he'd been powerless to save her from the illness they couldn't afford to treat. $85, someone yelled from the crowd. Victoria's desperate eyes swept the room until they found Daniel's. For a moment, their gazes locked, and he saw something that reminded him of Lucy. Pure terror mixed with fading hope that anyone might help. $100. The voice belonged to Clayton Morse, the wealthy cattle baron who owned half the territory. Victoria's face went white as Morse's cold smile spread across his weathered features. Daniel knew Morse's reputation with women. His own wife had died under mysterious circumstances, and since then he treated females like property to be acquired and discarded. Daniel felt his heart pounding. He had exactly $93 in his pocket. Money meant for winter supplies, medicine for Lucy, and food to last them through the harsh Wyoming months. Losing it would mean real hardship for his daughter. But looking at that terrified girl, then at Morse's predatory face, Daniel realized some things mattered more than money. His wife Sarah's final words echoed in his mind. "Promise me you'll protect those who can't protect themselves." What happened next would either save them all or destroy everything he'd built for his daughter. $200. Every head in the Red Horse Saloon turned toward the voice. Daniel Stone stepped forward through the crowd, his calloused blacksmith hands steady despite his racing pulse. The amount represented more than most men earned in 6 months of backbreaking labor. Marcus Webb's eyes lit up with greed as he banged his gavel. Well, do I hear 250? The room fell silent. $200 was an astronomical sum in Silver Creek, where most miners earned $3 a week if they were lucky. Victoria's tear-filled eyes found Daniel's face, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something other than lust or cruelty in a man's gaze. Clayton Morse's weathered face darkened as he studied Daniel with calculating eyes. The cattle baron wasn't accustomed to being outbid, especially not by a simple tradesman. His reputation demanded that he crush any challenge to his authority, but $200 was serious money, even for him. "You sure you want to make an enemy today, blacksmith?" Morse's voice carried the cold menace of a man who had killed before and would kill again. Daniel's jaw tightened. During his brief time as a deputy sheriff years ago, he'd learned to read dangerous men. Morse wasn't just angry, he was humiliated, and that made him deadly. "This girl's coming home with me," Daniel announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "But not for what you think." The saloon erupted in confused murmurs. Men who bought women at auctions didn't usually announce noble intentions. Webb banged his gavel eagerly. Going once. Going twice. Wait! Victoria's voice rang out clearly. She had found some inner strength, some last reserve of dignity that even this degradation couldn't steal. I need to know what you mean. Daniel approached the platform carefully, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. The last thing he wanted was to add to her terror. Miss, my name is Daniel Stone. I'm a widower with a daughter about your age. I couldn't stand by and watch this happen. His voice was gentle but firm. You're not going to be anyone's property. You're coming to my home where you'll have food, shelter, and respect. Nothing more expected. Victoria's legs nearly buckled with relief. You're not going to... You don't want me to... No, ma'am. We're walking out of here together, and you're coming to a place where you'll be safe and treated with the dignity every human being deserves. For the first time in days, Victoria felt like she could breathe. But that relief lasted exactly 30 seconds. Morse stepped between them and the door, his hand resting on his Colt 45. Hold on there, blacksmith. Nobody spends that kind of money on charity. What's your real game? Daniel positioned himself protectively in front of Victoria. No game, just doing what's right. Morse's laugh was cold as winter wind. Right? Boy, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Daniel noticed Morse's men had quietly positioned themselves around the saloon. 3 by the door, 2 more flanking the bar. They weren't just dealing with one angry cattle baron. They were surrounded. What mistake would that be? Daniel asked steadily. You think this is just about money, Morse said, his voice rising dangerously. But you don't know the whole story, do you, Webb? Marcus Webb suddenly looked nervous, sweat beading on his forehead. Now, Clayton, we had a fair auction, fair and square. Fair? Morse's hand moved closer to his gun. You didn't tell blacksmith boy here about our arrangement, did you? About how I already gave you $50 last week for first rights to this little dove? The crowd started backing toward the walls. When Clayton Morse got angry, people tended to get shot. Victoria grabbed Daniel's arm. Please, just leave me. Don't get killed over someone like me. But Daniel had already assessed the tactical situation. Morse's men controlled the exits, and the cattle baron was working himself into a killing rage. The smart play would be to walk away, take his financial loss, and protect his daughter from becoming an orphan. But as he looked at Victoria's terrified face, so young, so helpless, so much like Lucy might be in 10 years if the world stayed this cruel, Daniel realized that some things mattered more than smart plays. You've got 2 choices, blacksmith, Morse said, drawing his weapon halfway. Walk away and leave the girl, or try to take her and see what happens. Daniel looked at his own hands. Hands better suited to shaping iron than gunfights. He thought of Lucy waiting at home, needing her father. The sensible choice was obvious, but sometimes doing right meant doing dangerous. We're leaving together, Daniel said quietly. And if you want to stop us, you'll have to shoot an unarmed man in front of 20 witnesses. Morse's eyes narrowed. You think I won't? I think you're mean, but you're not stupid. Sheriff Palmer's office is right across the street. You gun down an innocent blacksmith, you'll hang before sundown. The standoff stretched like pulled wire. Every man in the saloon held his breath, waiting to see who would blink first. Victoria pressed closer to Daniel, feeling the tremor in his hands despite his steady voice. Then Morse started laughing, a sound that made everyone's skin crawl. You're right, blacksmith. I ain't stupid, which is why I ain't gonna shoot you here. He holstered his gun with deliberate slowness. But Silver Creek is a small territory. Roads get mighty dangerous after dark. Accidents happen all the time out there, in the wilderness. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Morse was letting them leave, but only so he could hunt them down outside town limits where there would be no witnesses. Smart man would take his loss and ride on, Daniel replied. Smart man wouldn't have started this fight, Morse countered. But you did start it, blacksmith, and I always finish what gets started. As they moved toward the door, Daniel realized Morse's real plan. The cattle baron would let them leave town, then track them to Daniel's isolated farm where he could take his revenge on both of them, and Lucy. The nightmare was just beginning. They made it to the hitching post, but freedom felt like an illusion. Main Street stretched before them like a gauntlet. and Daniel's farm was 6 miles away through empty prairie. 6 miles where Morse could do whatever he wanted without consequences. "There's something you need to know about Morse," Victoria whispered urgently as Daniel untied his horse. "Something Webb didn't tell you." "What?" "He's not just cruel. 3 months ago, he killed a merchant's daughter who tried to run from him. Sheriff Palmer covered it up because Morse owns half this county." Daniel felt his world tilt. He just signed their death warrants, and the law wouldn't lift a finger to help them. But as they prepared to mount his horse, Victoria noticed something that made her blood freeze. A small figure was running toward them down Main Street, calling out in a child's voice, "Papa! Papa! You're back early!" It was Lucy, her blonde braids bouncing as she ran, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. Daniel's heart stopped as his 8-year-old daughter approached, having somehow made it to town alone despite his strict instructions to stay with Mrs. Henderson. "Lucy, stop!" he called out, but she was too excited to listen. Behind them, Morse emerged from the saloon with his men, and Daniel saw the exact moment when the cattle baron's cruel mind started calculating new possibilities. Morse's eyes locked onto the approaching child, and his grin became something monstrous. "Well, well," Morse said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like our blacksmith brought his little girl to town. Sweet thing, ain't she?" Victoria grabbed Daniel's arm. "He's going to use her against you." Lucy reached them, breathing hard from her run. "Papa, Mrs. Henderson fell asleep, and I got scared, so I came to find you." She stopped mid-sentence, noticing the strange woman beside her father and the tense faces all around them. "Honey," Daniel said carefully, "I need you to get behind me and stay very quiet." But Morse was already moving closer, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. "That's a mighty pretty daughter you got there, Stone. Be a real shame if something happened to her on account of your poor judgment." The threat hit Daniel like a physical blow. This wasn't just about him and Victoria anymore. Morse had just made it clear that Lucy was now part of this deadly game. "You touch one hair on her head," Daniel started. "You'll what?" Morse interrupted. "Fight me? You ain't even armed, blacksmith." Lucy tugged on her father's coat. "Papa, I'm scared. Who is this man?" "My name's Victoria," she said, kneeling beside Lucy despite the danger. "Your papa's trying to help me, but it's gotten complicated." "Are you in trouble?" Lucy asked with innocent concern. "Yes, sweetheart. Bad trouble." Lucy looked up at her father with those trusting blue eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Papa always helps people in trouble. Mama taught him that." The innocence in her voice made Daniel's chest tight. His wife Sarah had indeed taught him to stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves. But Sarah had never faced Clayton Morse. Morse stepped closer, his patience clearly running out. "Time's up, blacksmith. What's it going to be? Your daughter's safety or this stranger's life?" Daniel looked at Lucy, then at Victoria, then at the crowd of onlookers who were watching this drama unfold like entertainment. The impossible choice was crushing him. But in that moment, he remembered something Sarah used to say. Sometimes the right choice isn't about choosing between good and bad. Sometimes it's about refusing to choose evil at all. What happened next would determine whether courage or cruelty ruled the day. Daniel Stone looked at his daughter's trusting face, then at Clayton Morse's predatory smile, and made a decision that surprised everyone in Silver Creek, including himself. "You're right, Morse. I'm not armed," Daniel's voice carried a strange calm. "But you're wrong about one thing." "Yeah? What's that?" "You think this is just between you and me, but look around." Morse frowned, momentarily confused. Daniel gestured toward the growing crowd that had spilled out of shops and businesses to watch the confrontation. "Half this town's been watching you threaten a child, Morse. Sheriff Palmer might be in your pocket, but Judge Morrison ain't, and neither is the territorial marshal who's due through here next week." Morse's confidence flickered. Daniel was right. This had become a public spectacle, and the cattle baron's reputation for cruelty was now on full display before witnesses who couldn't all be bought or intimidated. "Furthermore," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger, "that woman you're so desperate to claim has family coming to look for her. Victoria, tell him about your cousin." Victoria caught on immediately, understanding Daniel's strategy. My cousin rides with the Wyoming Rangers. He'll be here within the week, and he doesn't take kindly to men who hurt his family. It was a complete lie, but Morse didn't know that. The Rangers were feared throughout the territory for their swift and merciless justice. Morse's face reddened with rage and frustration. His perfect plan was unraveling in front of everyone. "You think you're real clever, don't you, blacksmith?" "I think I'm real tired of this conversation," Daniel replied. "Lucy, Victoria, get on the horse." But as they moved toward the hitching post, Morse made a desperate play. Bill, Jake, block their path. Two of Morse's men stepped forward, hands on their guns. The crowd gasped and started backing away. Several women grabbed their children and fled toward the safety of nearby buildings. That's when an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you boys." Everyone turned to see Dr. William Mitchell emerging from his office across the street. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came 6 other townsmen, all armed and looking determined. Among them were Tom Bradley, the banker, Henry Walsh, the store owner, and even old Pete Garrison, who ran the livery stable. Dr. Mitchell adjusted his spectacles and addressed Morse directly. "Clayton, we've had enough of your bullying in our town. These good people have done nothing wrong, and we won't stand by and watch you terrorize a child." Morse looked around wildly. Suddenly, his 5 men seemed outnumbered by the armed townspeople taking sides against him. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. "This ain't your fight, Doc," Morse snarled. "When a man threatens children in our street, it becomes everyone's fight," Tom Bradley said firmly, his banker's demeanor replaced by steel resolve. Lucy pressed closer to her father, sensing the electricity in the air. Victoria kept a protective hand on the child's shoulder, marveling at how quickly the community had rallied to their defense. "You all know what I can do to this town," Morse threatened, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I own the biggest ranch, employ half your men, buy most of your goods." "And we've all gotten tired of being afraid of you," Henry Walsh interrupted. His general store had been forced to give Morse credit for years, debts the cattle baron never intended to pay. "Maybe it's time for a change." For a moment it looked like Morse might draw anyway. Consequences be damned. His hand hovered over his gun while 8 armed men faced him down. Then Marcus Webb made everything worse. "Morse, you still owe me $400 from last month's poker game," the saloon owner called out with a nasty grin. "Maybe it's time to settle accounts. Matter of fact, I think that debt just transferred to our new friends here. Congratulations, Stone. You just inherited Morse's biggest problem." The implications hit everyone at once. If Morse owed Webb money and Webb was transferring that debt to Daniel, it meant Morse now had a legal claim he could pursue through violence, even if the townspeople protected them today. "That's not how debts work, Webb," Dr. Mitchell said sharply. "Actually, it is," came a new voice from the crowd. Judge Morrison himself had arrived, drawn by the commotion. The elderly jurist walked with a cane, but commanded more respect than any gunslinger in the territory. If Webb wants to assign Morse's debt to Stone, that's his right under territorial law, but Morse would have to agree to the transfer, and the debt would have to be legitimate. Morse's momentary grin faded. Judge Morrison was known for his strict interpretation of the law and his refusal to be intimidated by anyone. "Show me the paperwork, Webb," the judge demanded. Webb's face went pale. There was no paperwork because the poker debt was fictional, a desperate attempt to create legal leverage for Morse. "I see," Judge Morrison said when no documents appeared. "No paperwork means no legal debt. Morse, you and your men have exactly 10 minutes to leave town before I charge you with disturbing the peace and threatening children." Morse's last card had been played and lost. His men were already backing toward their horses, eager to avoid a shooting war with half the town. But as Morse prepared to mount his horse, Victoria did something that shocked everyone present. She stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the street despite her torn dress and obvious fear. "Mr. Morse, before you go, I have something to tell you about your wife's death." Morse froze, his face going deadly pale. The crowd fell silent. Morse's wife had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, and her death had been the turning point that made him cruel and bitter. "What did you say?" he whispered. Victoria took a deep breath, knowing this was the most dangerous moment of her life. "Your wife didn't die in childbirth, like everyone thinks. I was there that night, working as Webb's bookkeeper. I saw what really happened. The entire crowd held its breath. If Victoria knew something different about one of the territory's most tragic events, it could change everything. She was murdered, Victoria said quietly, and I know who did it. Morse's world, Key, and his reason for 5 years of revenge against life itself was about to crumble completely. The revelation hit like thunder across the silent crowd. Morse's face transformed from rage to confusion to something approaching desperate hope. "What are you saying?" he whispered, dismounting his horse with shaking hands. Victoria glanced at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. Lucy watched with wide eyes, sensing the importance of this moment, even if she didn't understand it. "Your wife came to Webb that night, desperate for money to pay a doctor in Denver. The baby was breached, and she knew the local doctor couldn't save them both." Morse's hands trembled. "Go on." "Webb refused unless she worked for him first. When she said no, he got violent. I tried to stop him, but he was drunk and angry. She fell, hit her head on the corner of his desk. By the time we got her to the doctor, internal bleeding had started." "My son?" Morse's voice cracked. "I had a son. Webb told you both died to cover up what he'd done. Your boy lived 3 days. He's buried in the church cemetery under the name Baby Doe because Webb said no one claimed him." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Clayton Morse, the territory's most feared man, broke down completely. Years of bitterness and cruelty had been built on a lie. Judge Morrison stepped forward gravely. "Webb, if this is true, you're under arrest for murder, fraud, and conspiracy." Webb tried to run, but was quickly surrounded by townsmen who had found their courage. As he was dragged away, he screamed, "She can't prove nothing. It's her word against mine." "Actually," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, "I delivered that baby. I always wondered why Morse never came to claim his son's body. I kept records." Morse sank to his knees in the dusty street, sobbing for the child he never knew he had, and the wife whose death had been twisted into a lie that poisoned his soul. Daniel helped him to his feet. "There's a grave you need to visit," he said gently, "and a town that needs to heal from 5 years of fear." Victoria knelt beside Lucy. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Lucy nodded solemnly. "Is the scary man going to be good now?" "I think he's going to try," Victoria said, looking at Morse with something approaching pity rather than fear. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. "Well, this has been most illuminating. Stone, I believe you have some arrangements to make regarding Miss Victoria's future." Daniel looked at Victoria, then at Lucy, then at the community that had stood with them against injustice. His $200 was gone. Winter would be harder than ever. But somehow none of that mattered anymore. "Victoria," he said formally, "I know this isn't the best circumstances, but would you consider staying with Lucy and me? Not as property, but as family. We could use someone who's as brave as you've proven to be." Victoria's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "I thought I'd lost everything, but maybe I found something better." Lucy tugged on Victoria's torn dress. "Does this mean you're going to be my new mama?" Victoria knelt and hugged the child who had become the center of this whole desperate drama. "Would you like that?" "Yes," Lucy said simply. "Mama always said Papa would know when the right person came along. I think she sent you." As the crowd began to disperse, talking excitedly about the day's events, Daniel realized that sometimes the most expensive choices turn out to be the greatest bargains. He'd spent his last $200 and gained a wife and mother for Lucy. The town had found its courage and freed itself from a tyrant's grip, and Clayton Morse had learned the truth that might finally let him find peace. But their story was far from over. Building a family from strangers and healing a community from years of fear would take more than one dramatic day. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the Red Horse Saloon, Victoria May stood in the doorway of Daniel Stone's modest cabin, watching him teach Lucy how to work the bellows at his forge. The sound of hammer on anvil rang across the Wyoming prairie like a heartbeat, steady and sure. She still couldn't quite believe this was her life now. The cabin was small but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a main room that served as kitchen and parlor, and Daniel's blacksmith shop attached to the back. Victoria had taken the smaller bedroom, insisting that Lucy keep her own space, while Daniel continued to sleep on a cot in the main room. It wasn't a conventional arrangement, but nothing about their situation was conventional. "Victoria, come see!" Lucy called out, her face glowing with excitement. "Papa's teaching me to make horseshoe nails." Victoria approached carefully. The forge was Daniel's domain, and she didn't want to intrude. But Lucy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Daniel smiled as she joined them. "She's got natural talent," he said, guiding Lucy's small hands as she held the tongs. "Steady grip, good eye for the metal's color. Her mother would be proud." It was the first time Daniel had mentioned his wife Sarah without the shadow of grief crossing his face. Victoria took that as progress. "What was she like?" Victoria asked softly. "Your wife?" Daniel considered the question while Lucy focused intently on her work. "Sarah was light. Everything about her was bright. Her laugh, her smile, the way she saw good in everyone." He paused. "She would have liked you, would have said you had strength hiding under all that gentleness." "I don't feel strong," Victoria admitted. "Most days I feel like I'm pretending to know what I'm doing." "That's what strength looks like," Daniel said simply. "Doing what needs doing, even when you're scared." Lucy looked up from her work. "Are you scared of us, Victoria?" The question was so innocent, so direct, that Victoria's throat tightened. "No, sweetheart. I'm scared of disappointing you, of not being the mother you deserve." "Mama used to say families aren't born perfect," Lucy said with 8-year-old wisdom. "They get perfect by practicing love every day." Victoria exchanged a glance with Daniel, both marveling at the child's insight. Sarah Stone had clearly raised her daughter well before illness took her. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Daniel's body tensed automatically. After years of dealing with Clayton Morse's threats, unexpected visitors still put him on edge. But the rider who appeared was Dr. Mitchell, his medical bag secured behind his saddle. "Afternoon, folks," the doctor called out, dismounting with the careful movements of a man past 60. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just family time," Daniel said, and Victoria felt a warm flutter in her chest at being included in that phrase. "What brings you out our way, Doc?" Dr. Mitchell's expression grew serious. "I'm afraid it's about Clayton Morse." Victoria's blood ran cold. "Is he causing trouble again?" No, nothing like that," the doctor said quickly, seeing her fear. "It's just, well, he's been asking about you, Victoria, about what you saw that night his wife died." Daniel stepped protectively closer to Victoria. "What kind of asking?" "The peaceful kind," Dr. Mitchell assured them. "He's been sober for 2 weeks straight. First time in 5 years, according to Tom Bradley. Spending his days at the cemetery, talking to his wife's grave, and the little marker I showed him for his son." Lucy tugged on Victoria's skirt. "Is the scary man sad now instead of mean?" "Sometimes people are mean because they're sad," Victoria explained gently. "And sometimes when they stop being sad, they can stop being mean too." Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Wise words. The thing is, Morse wants to speak with you, Victoria. He's asked me to arrange a meeting, somewhere public, with witnesses, so you'd feel safe." "Absolutely not," Daniel said immediately. "I'm not putting Victoria through that." "It's my choice," Victoria said quietly but firmly. "What does he want to talk about?" "He wants to understand what really happened that night. Every detail. And—" Dr. Mitchell hesitated. "He wants to apologize. Says he's spent 5 years taking his grief out on innocent people, and you're the one who showed him the truth." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, considering. Daniel watched her face, ready to support whatever decision she made. "I'll meet with him," she said finally. "But at the church with you and Daniel present, and Lucy stays home with Mrs. Henderson." Daniel frowned. "Victoria, you don't owe him anything." "No, but maybe he needs to hear it. Maybe we both do." She looked at Lucy, who was listening intently to every word. Sometimes facing hard truths is the only way to heal. The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday after church services. Half the town found reasons to linger in the churchyard, curious about this unprecedented encounter between the territory's former tyrant and the woman who had brought about his transformation. Clayton Morse looked like a different man. Clean-shaven, sober, his clothes neat rather than the trail-dusty roughness he'd worn for years. But his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult reckonings. He approached their small group, Victoria, Daniel, Dr. Mitchell, and Pastor Williams, with his hat in his hands. "Miss Victoria," he said quietly, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Victoria studied his face, looking for any trace of the predatory cruelty she remembered from the saloon. She found only exhaustion and what might have been genuine remorse. "Mr. Morse, I need to know," he said simply, "everything about that night, every detail you can remember. I've been living with lies for 5 years, and I can't carry them anymore." So Victoria told him about Webb's drunken rage when Morse's wife refused his demands, about the sickening crack when her head hit the desk corner, about the frantic ride to Dr. Mitchell's office, knowing it was probably too late, about holding Morse's newborn son as he drew his last breaths, too small and weak to survive without his mother. Morse listened without interruption, tears streaming down his weathered face. When Victoria finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I named him Jacob," he said finally. "In my mind, I named him Jacob, after my father. I used to imagine teaching him to ride, to rope cattle, to be a good man." He looked up at Victoria. "Webb told me they both died instantly, said there was nothing anyone could have done." "There wasn't, Doctor," Mitchell said gently. "The head injury caused internal bleeding. Even if we'd known immediately, medicine isn't advanced enough to fix that kind of damage. But she suffered because of Webb's cruelty," Morse said, "and I spent 5 years making everyone else suffer because I thought God had abandoned me." He turned to Victoria. "You could have kept quiet. Let me go on believing the lie. Why didn't you?" Victoria considered the question. "Because lies poison everything they touch. And because that little boy deserved to have his father know he existed, even if it was too late to save him." Morse reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden cross, carefully carved and polished. "I made this for Jacob's grave. Would you come with me to place it? I don't think I can face it alone." Daniel started to object, but Victoria placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Of course." The small procession made its way to Silver Creek Cemetery, where a simple wooden marker read "Baby Doe, taken too soon." Morse knelt beside the grave and carefully placed the cross, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered. "I'm sorry I never knew you. I'm sorry I wasn't there. But I know about you now, and I promise I'll do better. I'll be the kind of man your mama would have wanted you to know." Victoria knelt beside him, placing a wildflower bouquet against the cross. "He knows you love him," she said softly. "Love doesn't die with the body. Your wife knows too." When they returned to town, Morse pulled Daniel aside. "Stone, I owe you an apology too. And more than that," he pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. "This is what I cost you that day. The $200, plus what you would have made if you'd had that money for winter supplies and materials." Daniel stared at the pouch. "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is. My grief doesn't excuse the harm I caused." Morse looked toward Victoria, who was accepting thanks and well wishes from townspeople. "You did something brave that day. You saw a woman in trouble and risked everything to help her. That's the kind of man I should have been." Daniel accepted the pouch, understanding that Morse needed to make this gesture as much as Daniel needed the financial security it represented. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked. "Try to be worthy of the second chance I've been given," Morse said. "Maybe start by using my ranch to help people instead of threatening them." As they walked back toward the group, Victoria was surrounded by women from the church, all talking at once about wedding plans and household advice. Lucy had somehow escaped Mrs. Henderson's supervision and was bouncing excitedly between the adults. "Victoria's going to marry Papa," Lucy announced to anyone who would listen. "And then we'll be a real family." Victoria blushed deeply, but she didn't correct the child. Daniel caught her eye and smiled, and she felt that warm flutter in her chest again. They hadn't talked about marriage yet, not formally. But watching Daniel interact with the townspeople, seeing how naturally he'd stepped into the role of protector and provider, Victoria knew it was only a matter of time. She'd been sold like cattle 2 weeks ago, convinced her life was over. Now she was planning a wedding and helping to heal a community's wounds. Sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms. As they prepared to head home, Pastor Williams pulled them aside. "I'd be honored to perform the ceremony," he said quietly. "Whenever you're ready." Daniel looked at Victoria, a question in his eyes. She nodded, feeling more certain than she had about anything in her life. "How about next month?" Daniel suggested. "Give folks time to plan and give us time to do this right." "Next month sounds perfect," Victoria agreed. Lucy whooped with joy, and even Clayton Morse smiled. The first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in 5 years. The sun was setting as they rode home to their little cabin, casting long golden shadows across the prairie. Victoria sat behind Daniel on his horse, her arms around his waist, feeling Lucy's small body pressed trustingly against her back. This was family, not perfect, not conventional, but built on choice rather than blood, on courage rather than convenience, and it was theirs. 3 weeks into October, Silver Creek was buzzing with wedding preparations. Victoria May had become the center of attention for every woman in town, all eager to help plan what they were calling the wedding that saved Silver Creek. Victoria stood on a wooden crate in the back room of Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, trying not to wince as the elderly seamstress pinned and adjusted the wedding gown that had been her deceased daughter's. "Hold still, dear," Mrs. Henderson murmured around a mouthful of pins. "Margaret was about your size, but we need to take in the waist just a touch." The dress was beautiful, cream-colored silk with delicate pearl buttons and intricate embroidery around the bodice. Victoria had protested accepting such a precious family heirloom, but Mrs. Henderson had insisted. "Margaret would have wanted it worn by someone who understood what real love looks like," the older woman had said firmly. "You and Daniel, you chose each other for the right reasons." Lucy sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully threading flowers into small bouquets with the concentrated attention of a child given an important task. She'd appointed herself a chief wedding coordinator and took the responsibility seriously. "Victoria, do you think Papa's nervous about getting married?" Lucy asked, looking up from her flowers. "I think he might be a little nervous," Victoria admitted. "Are you nervous about me marrying your papa?" Lucy considered this carefully. "Number Mama visits me in dreams sometimes, and she told me you were going to take good care of us. But she also said to make sure Papa doesn't forget to eat when he gets busy with wedding things." Victoria's throat tightened. Even 3 years after Sarah's death, her presence was still felt in this family. Victoria had learned not to see that as competition, but as blessing. She was joining a family that knew how to love deeply. "We'll make sure Papa eats," Victoria promised. Mrs. Henderson stepped back to examine her work. "There. Perfect. Daniel Stone won't know what hit him." The shop's bell jingled, and 3 more women entered. Mrs. Bradley, the banker's wife, Mrs. Walsh from the general store, and surprisingly, Mrs. Palmer, the sheriff's wife who had previously kept her distance from Victoria. "How's our bride doing?" Mrs. Bradley asked cheerfully, then stopped short when she saw Victoria in the wedding dress. "Oh my, Daniel is going to forget how to speak." "It's beautiful," Mrs. Palmer said quietly. "Victoria, I owe you an apology. When my husband told me what really happened that day at the saloon, and how you helped Clayton Morse find peace, well, I was wrong about you." Victoria stepped down from the crate carefully. "There's nothing to apologize for. You were protecting your family the only way you knew how. Still," Mrs. Palmer continued, "I want to make it right. My late mother's china set has been sitting unused for years. I'd be honored if you'd accept it as a wedding gift." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. In 3 weeks, she'd gone from being the town's charity case to being genuinely welcomed into the community. "That's very kind," she said, "but you've all already given us so much—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Walsh interrupted. "A proper wedding needs proper celebration. Henry's donating the food for the reception, Tom Bradley's handling the decorations, and Pastor Williams says half the territory wants to attend." Lucy bounced to her feet. "Really? Half the territory?" "People have heard what happened here," Mrs. Henderson explained. "How one man's courage changed everything, how the truth set Clayton Morse free, how our community found its backbone. They want to see the couple that started it all. Victoria felt overwhelmed. She'd spent most of her life invisible, forgotten. Now she was the center of attention for reasons she still couldn't quite believe. The bell jingled again, and Dr. Mitchell entered, looking unusually serious. "Ladies," he greeted them, then focused on Victoria. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to speak with you. It's about Daniel." Victoria's blood turned to ice. "Is he hurt?" No, nothing like that. But there's been a development. A man came to my office this morning asking questions about you and Daniel. Said he was a territorial investigator looking into the auction incident." The room fell silent. Lucy moved closer to Victoria instinctively. "What kind of questions?" Mrs. Palmer asked, her husband's law enforcement instincts evident. Whether the auction was legitimate, whether Daniel actually paid the money he claimed, whether there was collusion between Daniel and Webb to defraud Clayton Morse. Dr. Mitchell's frown deepened. "The thing is, real territorial investigators carry credentials and work through local law enforcement. This man had neither." Victoria sank into a chair as the implications hit her. Someone's trying to invalidate the auction? "But why?" Mrs. Bradley asked. "Webb's in jail. Morse has made his peace with everything. Because if the auction was fraudulent, then Victoria's still legally Webb's property," Mrs. Palmer said grimly, "and debts can be transferred or sold." The women exchanged worried glances. They all understood what this meant. Someone was trying to claim Victoria through legal technicalities. "Who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Webb's got family," Dr. Mitchell said. "A brother in Denver who's known for buying up questionable debts and pursuing them aggressively. If he thinks he can make money from this situation..." Victoria felt a familiar terror clawing at her chest. Just when she'd thought she was safe, when she'd allowed herself to hope for a future, the past was reaching out to drag her back. "I need to find Daniel," she said, standing abruptly. "Victoria, wait." Mrs. Palmer caught her arm. "Let's think this through. If someone's building a legal case, we need to be smart about how we respond." But Victoria was already moving toward the door, Lucy right behind her. She'd found happiness, found family, found love, and she'd fight to protect it with everything she had. They found Daniel at the forge, hammering out horseshoes for the Hendersons' wagon team. The rhythmic ringing of metal on metal stopped when he saw Victoria's face. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, setting down his hammer. Victoria quickly explained Dr. Mitchell's warning. Daniel's expression grew darker with each word. "So Webb's brother thinks he can claim you like property?" Daniel's voice was dangerously quiet. "It's possible he has legal grounds," Victoria admitted. "If he can prove the original debt was legitimate and that the auction was somehow fraudulent, then we'll prove it wasn't," Daniel said firmly. "Judge Morrison witnessed the whole thing. Half the town was there." "But what if that's not enough?" Lucy asked in a small voice. "What if they take Victoria away?" Daniel knelt to Lucy's level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Lucy, look at me. No one is taking Victoria away from us. Not ever. Do you understand?" "But Papa, what if the law says..." "Sometimes the law is wrong," Daniel said quietly. "And when it is, good people have to stand together and do what's right instead." Victoria felt her heart swell with love and fear in equal measure. Daniel was promising to fight the law itself if necessary to protect their family. But such fights could destroy him, could leave Lucy orphaned if things went badly. "Daniel, maybe I should..." "No." His voice cut through her words like a blade. "Whatever you're thinking, the answer is no. We're getting married in 1 week, and no territorial investigation or Denver lawyer is going to change that." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the open doors of the forge, they could see a small group of riders approaching the cabin, official-looking men in dark suits, with the bearing of law enforcement. "That would be them, Doctor," Mitchell said grimly, having followed Victoria from town. Daniel positioned himself protectively in front of Victoria and Lucy. "Stay behind me." The lead rider dismounted, a thin man with calculating eyes and expensive clothes that looked out of place in the Wyoming territory. "Daniel Stone?" the man asked. "That's right. And you are?" "Theodore Webb, territorial debt collector and brother of the late Marcus Webb." The man's smile was cold and predatory. I'm here about the woman you illegally obtained from my brother's establishment. There was nothing illegal about it, Daniel said steadily. The auction was witnessed by half the town and approved by the local judge. Ah, but there's the problem. Theodore Webb pulled out a folder of documents. You see, my brother owed significant debts at the time of his arrest, debts that I've now purchased. And among his assets was a contractual agreement regarding this woman's services. Victoria stepped forward despite Daniel's protective stance. What kind of agreement? Theodore Webb's smile widened unpleasantly. A binding contract of indenture. You agreed to work for my brother for 7 years to pay off your guardian's gambling debts. The auction was merely for temporary companionship services. The underlying debt remained. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. If such a contract existed, and if it was legally binding, then her situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. Show me this contract, Daniel demanded. Theodore Webb handed over a document with flourishes and official-looking seals. Daniel examined it carefully, his expression growing grimmer by the moment. This is dated after the auction, Daniel said finally. It's fake. Are you accusing me of fraud, Mr. Stone? Because I have witnesses who will testify that this document was signed by both my brother and Miss Victoria months before the auction occurred. Victoria's heart sank. She remembered signing papers in Webb's office, but she'd been frightened, barely literate, and hadn't understood what she was agreeing to. It was entirely possible one of those documents had been exactly what Theodore Webb claimed. Even if this is real, Dr. Mitchell interjected, indenture contracts aren't enforceable in Wyoming territory. Actually, they are, Theodore Webb replied smoothly. If they were entered into legally in Colorado territory, which this one was, interstate commerce law makes them fully transferable and enforceable. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. What do you want? Simple. The woman returns with me to Denver to fulfill the terms of her contract. 7 years of service as agreed. After that, she'll be free to make her own choices. 7 years, Victoria whispered. By then, Lucy would be grown. Daniel might have remarried someone else, and the life they'd built would be nothing but a memory. However, Theodore Webb continued, I'm a reasonable man. If you can pay the full value of the debt, $5,000, plus interest and collection fees, I'd be willing to release the contract. $5,000. More money than Daniel would make in 5 years. It might as well have been $5 million. Daniel looked at Victoria, then at Lucy, then back at the predatory smile on Theodore Webb's face. In that moment, Victoria saw him make the same kind of desperate calculation he'd made at the auction. Give me 1 week, Daniel said. Theodore Webb's eyebrows rose. You think you can raise $5,000 in a week? I think I can try. Very well, 1 week. But understand, Mr. Stone, if you can't produce the money, the woman comes with me. And if you attempt to interfere with the legal enforcement of this contract, you'll be arrested for obstruction of justice. As the men remounted and rode away, Victoria sank to her knees in the dust. Their wedding was 6 days away, but unless Daniel could work a miracle, she'd be on her way to Denver instead of walking down the aisle. The nightmare she thought was over had only just begun. That evening, Daniel's cabin became a war room. Every prominent citizen of Silver Creek had gathered around his kitchen table, studying the indenture contract by lamplight, while Victoria sat silent in the corner, feeling like a piece of property being discussed rather than a human being with her own voice. Judge Morrison held the document up to the light, examining the paper and ink with the scrutiny of a man who'd seen his share of fraudulent legal papers. The document appears legitimate, he said finally. The signatures look authentic, the territorial seal is correct, and the legal language follows proper indenture contract format. But Victoria says she doesn't remember signing anything like this, Dr. Mitchell protested. I signed many papers that night, Victoria said quietly. Webb told me they were for room and board receipts, payment schedules. I was barely literate then, and I was terrified. I signed whatever he put in front of me. Daniel's jaw tightened. So he tricked her into signing her life away. Fraud or not, the contract appears legally binding, Judge Morrison said grimly, and Theodore Webb has the resources to enforce it through territorial courts. Tom Bradley, the banker, had been working with pencil and paper. I've calculated everything we can liquidate in town. Even if every family contributed their life savings, we'd be lucky to raise $2,000. The room fell silent. $2,000 was an enormous sum for their small community, but it was less than half of what they needed. "What about Clayton Morse?" Mrs. Palmer suggested. "He owns the largest ranch in the territory. Surely he could help." "Morse sold most of his cattle last month," Dr. Mitchell said. "He's been paying restitution to families he wronged over the years. His ranch is land-rich but cash-poor." Daniel stared at the contract, feeling the weight of impossibility crushing down on him. He'd promised Lucy that no one would take Victoria away, but promises couldn't fight territorial law. "There has to be something," he said desperately. "Some legal precedent, some technicality." "Actually," a new voice said from the doorway, "there might be." Everyone turned to see Clayton Morse standing in the entrance, his hat in his hands. He looked older than his 45 years, worn down by weeks of sobriety and soul-searching, but his eyes held a clarity they hadn't seen in years. "Clayton," Judge Morrison said, "we didn't expect to see you here." "Heard about the situation from Doc Mitchell," Morse said, stepping into the room. "Been doing some thinking about debts and contracts and what's legal versus what's right." He pulled a chair up to the table, and Victoria noticed that no one flinched or moved away from him. The transformation in how the community saw their former tormentor was remarkable. "See, I've been learning a lot about territorial law lately," Morse continued. "Had to when I started trying to make amends for all the legal trouble I caused. And there's something about this contract that bothers me." "What?" Daniel asked. Morse pointed to a section of the document. "This clause here says Victoria agreed to work for Marcus Webb specifically. Not his business, not his estate, but for Marcus Webb, the individual." Judge Morrison leaned forward, studying the language more carefully. "Go on." "Well, Marcus Webb is dead," Morse said simply. "You can't fulfill a personal service contract to a dead man. And Theodore Webb isn't Marcus Webb. He's a separate legal entity." The room stirred with the first hope they'd felt all evening. "Are you saying the contract died with Marcus?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "I'm saying a territorial judge might rule that way," Morse replied, "especially if we could prove that the debt was based on fraudulent gambling losses in the first place. Victoria's guardian's gambling debts, the entire foundation of her indenture, had never been properly investigated. If they could prove those debts were fabricated or inflated, the whole contract might collapse." "How do we prove that?" Tom Bradley asked. Morse was quiet for a moment. "We'd need records, witness testimony, maybe even the gambling equipment if it was rigged. All of which would be in Denver," Judge Morrison pointed out, "along with witnesses who might have been paid to lie. Or," Morse said slowly, "we could find evidence right here in Silver Creek." He looked directly at Victoria. "You said you worked as Webb's bookkeeper that night my wife died. Did you keep records? Account books? Financial documents?" Victoria's heart began to race. "I kept copies of everything in a ledger. Webb insisted on duplicates for all transactions. But when I fled to avoid the auction, I left everything behind." "Where?" Daniel asked urgently. "Hidden under a loose floorboard in the room above the saloon, along with other documents I thought might be important someday." The room erupted in excited conversation. If Victoria's records could prove that Marcus Webb had been systematically defrauding people, including inventing gambling debts to create indenture contracts, it might invalidate Theodore Webb's entire claim. "There's just one problem," Sheriff Palmer said, speaking for the first time. "The saloon is sealed as a crime scene pending Webb's trial. No one's allowed inside without a court order." "How long would that take?" Daniel asked. "Weeks, maybe months," Judge Morrison replied, "and we only have 6 days." The hope that had flickered to life began to dim again. They were tantalizingly close to a solution, but bureaucracy stood in their way. That's when Lucy spoke up from where she'd been sitting quietly in the corner. "What if someone was already inside?" she asked innocently. All the adults turned to look at her. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Victoria asked. "Well, if someone was already inside before it got sealed, they wouldn't be breaking in, would they? They'd just be finishing what they were doing." The adults exchanged glances. The logic was dubious at best, but it revealed a possible loophole. "Lucy," Daniel said carefully, "are you suggesting that someone might have had legitimate business in that building before it was sealed?" "Maybe Victoria forgot something really important," Lucy said with 8-year-old solemnity. Maybe she needs to get her sewing supplies back. Mama always said a seamstress's tools are her livelihood. Sheriff Palmer rubbed his forehead. I cannot officially condone breaking into a sealed crime scene. But if someone happened to mention that they needed to retrieve personal property that was left behind in the confusion, Dr. Mitchell said thoughtfully, and if that someone happened to discover evidence of crimes while collecting their personal belongings, Tom Bradley added, such evidence would still be admissible in court, Judge Morrison finished, especially if it supported the investigation into Webb's fraudulent activities. Daniel looked around the room at these respectable citizens who were contemplating bending the law to protect Victoria's freedom. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same community that had once feared to challenge authority was now willing to risk everything to defend one of their own. It would have to be done tonight, Sheriff Palmer said reluctantly, and whoever does it would have to be very careful not to disturb other evidence. I'll go, Victoria said immediately. Absolutely not, Daniel replied. If you're caught, it would only make things worse. But I'm the only one who knows exactly where the ledger is hidden, Victoria protested. Then you'll have to describe it very clearly to whoever does go, Morse said. Because Daniel's right. You can't be the one to take this risk. I'll do it, Morse continued. I've got the most experience with unofficial activities. And if I'm caught, Theodore Webb can't use it against Victoria's case. Daniel studied the man who had once been their greatest enemy and was now volunteering to risk imprisonment for Victoria's freedom. Why? Daniel asked simply. Why would you do this for us? Morse was quiet for a moment. Because 5 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me and spent the time since then making everyone else pay for my pain. Victoria gave me back the truth about my wife and son. The least I can do is help her stay free to build the life I never could. The plan was simple but dangerous. Morse would enter the saloon through the back entrance, a route he knew well from his drinking days. Victoria would draw him a detailed map of the building's layout and the exact location of the hidden ledger. He'd retrieve the documents and slip away before dawn. If the ledger contained proof of Webb's systematic fraud, they'd have grounds to challenge the indenture contract. If not, they'd be back where they started, but with one less option and one more crime on their conscience. As the meeting broke up, each person committed to their role in the desperate gamble. Tom Bradley would prepare legal arguments, Judge Morrison would research precedents, Dr. Mitchell would coordinate with territorial officials, Sheriff Palmer would reluctantly provide alibi coverage for Morse's activities, and Daniel would wait, pray, and hope that a man he'd once considered his enemy could save the woman he loved. Victoria, Morse said quietly as the others filed out, I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, you've already saved more lives than you realize. Mine, for starters. This whole town's really. We were all living in fear before you showed us what courage looked like. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I wasn't being courageous. I was just trying to survive. Sometimes those are the same thing, Morse replied. As he disappeared into the night, Victoria could only pray that his mission would succeed, because in less than 6 days, she would either be walking down the aisle to marry Daniel, or she'd be on a stagecoach to Denver to begin 7 years of servitude. The ledger hidden beneath the saloon floor held the key to her future, and Clayton Morse, the man who had once terrified her, was now the only person who could retrieve it. Dawn would reveal whether redemption could triumph over the law or whether the past would finally claim its due. Dawn broke gray and cold over Silver Creek, and Clayton Morse hadn't returned. Daniel stood at his cabin window, watching the empty road while Victoria paced behind him, and Lucy sat at the kitchen table, picking at her untouched breakfast. The plan had been for Morse to retrieve the ledger and return before sunrise. Now the sun was climbing higher, and there was no sign of him. Maybe he had to wait for the right moment, Victoria said, though her voice carried no conviction. Maybe there were people around. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through her words. But instead of one rider, a group of 6 men was thundering toward their cabin. At the head rode Theodore Webb, his expensive clothes immaculate despite the early hour. Behind him came Sheriff Palmer, looking grim, and 4 men Victoria didn't recognize. Daniel's blood turned to ice as he saw what one of the strangers was carrying: Clayton Morse's hat and gun belt. Papa? Lucy's voice was small and frightened. "Stay inside," Daniel said firmly, grabbing his rifle from above the door. But Victoria was already moving past him, her face set with determination. Theodore Webb dismounted with theatrical flourish, his cold smile wider than ever. "Good morning, Mr. Stone. I trust you slept well." "Where's Clayton Morse?" Daniel demanded. "Ah, you mean your accomplice in last night's criminal activity?" Theodore Webb pulled out a folded document. "Mr. Morse is currently in the territorial jail in Laramie, charged with breaking and entering, theft, and obstruction of justice." Victoria felt her knees nearly buckle. "Is he hurt?" "He resisted arrest," one of the unnamed men said with satisfaction. "Had to convince him to come quietly." Sheriff Palmer looked sick. "Daniel, I tried to warn him, but these federal marshals arrived yesterday evening. They were waiting for him." Theodore Webb's grin became predatory. "Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate such a desperate move? I've been dealing with debtors who try to destroy evidence for 20 years. The building has been under surveillance since I arrived in town." He gestured to the marshals. "These gentlemen witnessed Mr. Morse breaking into a sealed crime scene and stealing documents that belonged to my brother's estate. Documents that, I'm told, he hoped would invalidate Miss Victoria's legitimate indenture contract." Daniel's rifle never wavered from Theodore Webb's chest, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Worse, they were now on the wrong side of the law. "Unfortunately for your friend," Theodore Webb continued, "the documents he stole actually confirm the legitimacy of the debts. My brother kept meticulous records, and Miss Victoria's guardian did indeed owe substantial gambling debts that she legally assumed responsibility for." Victoria stepped forward, her voice steady despite her terror. "Show me these records." Theodore Webb nodded to one of the marshals, who produced a leather satchel. From it came a ledger, not the one Victoria had hidden, but a different one entirely. "These are Marcus Webb's official account books," Theodore Webb said, opening the ledger to reveal pages of neat entries, "including detailed records of your guardian's gambling losses and your signed agreement to work off the debt." Victoria stared at the entries. They looked authentic: dates, amounts, witness signatures. But something was wrong. The handwriting was too clean, too consistent. Marcus Webb had been drunk most of the time she'd known him, and his handwriting had been barely legible scrawl. "These are forgeries," she said firmly. "Are they?" Theodore Webb closed the ledger. "Can you prove that? Because I have 3 witnesses who will testify that they saw your guardian gambling and losing these exact amounts." Daniel saw the trap closing around them. Even if Victoria was right about the forgeries, they had no evidence to prove it. The real ledger was either destroyed or in Theodore Webb's possession now. "What do you want?" Daniel asked quietly. "I want what was legally agreed to," Theodore Webb replied. "Miss Victoria comes with me to Denver to fulfill her 7-year contract. You and your daughter can go on with your lives, and everyone can forget this unfortunate episode of attempted fraud and obstruction of justice." "And if I refuse?" Theodore Webb shrugged. "Then you'll be arrested as an accomplice to Mr. Morse's crimes. Your daughter will become a ward of the territory, and Miss Victoria will still come to Denver, but as a convicted criminal rather than someone working off a legitimate debt." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Daniel could fight, but it would mean leaving Lucy orphaned. He could run, but they'd be fugitives forever. Or he could surrender Victoria to 7 years of servitude and live with that betrayal for the rest of his life. Lucy suddenly stood up from the kitchen table, her young voice cutting through the adult tension. "Mr. Webb, you're lying." Everyone turned to stare at the 8-year-old girl who had just called a territorial official a liar. "Lucy," Daniel started, but she was already walking toward Theodore Webb with her chin raised in defiance. "My mama taught me to read people's faces," Lucy said with startling maturity. "She said liars always look away when they're telling the biggest lies, and you keep looking away when you talk about those papers." Theodore Webb's smile faltered. "Little girl, you don't understand." "I understand that you want to steal Victoria away from us," Lucy interrupted. "But you can't, because she's ours now. Papa bought her fair and square, and Judge Morrison said it was legal, and God says families should stick together." "The law," Theodore Webb began. "The law says you're wrong," came a new voice from behind the group. Everyone turned to see Judge Morrison approaching on horseback, flanked by Dr. Mitchell and Tom Bradley. But they weren't alone. Following them came a line of riders that included every prominent citizen of Silver Creek, plus faces Victoria didn't recognize. Judge Morrison dismounted stiffly, his authority evident despite his advanced age. "Mr. Webb, I'm afraid there's been a development in your case." Theodore Webb's confidence wavered. "What kind of development?" "The kind where your carefully constructed fraud falls apart under scrutiny," Judge Morrison replied, producing his own set of documents. "You see, while you were having Mr. Morse arrested for retrieving evidence, we were conducting our own investigation." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. "Turns out Clayton wasn't the only one who understood territorial law. Tom Bradley here has connections with banks throughout Colorado and Wyoming territories." Tom Bradley unfolded a telegram. "This morning I received confirmation from the Denver Territorial Bank that your brother's gambling debts were settled by insurance payments after his death. The debts you're trying to collect were already paid in full." Theodore Webb's face went white. "That's impossible." "Furthermore," Judge Morrison continued, "we discovered that you've been running this same scheme in 3 other territories, buying up questionable debts from deceased criminals and using forged documents to claim ownership of their victims." The marshals were looking uncomfortable now, hands moving away from their weapons as they realized they might be on the wrong side of a federal fraud case. The Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne was very interested to learn about your activities, Dr. Mitchell added, "especially when we showed them the real ledger." Victoria's heart leaped. "The real ledger?" Judge Morrison smiled. "Clayton Morse may have gotten himself arrested, but not before he passed the evidence to someone else. Someone who was waiting outside the saloon in case things went wrong." Sheriff Palmer stepped forward, looking sheepish. "I couldn't officially help with breaking into a crime scene, but I could accidentally be in the area to provide assistance if a citizen got into trouble while retrieving his personal property." From his saddlebag, Sheriff Palmer produced the leather-bound book Victoria had hidden months ago. Her own handwriting filled the pages, records of Marcus Webb's actual dealings, including proof that most of his debts were fabricated and that he'd been systematically defrauding desperate people for years. "This ledger proves that your brother was running an illegal gambling operation using rigged games and fake debts," Judge Morrison said to Theodore Webb. "It also proves that Miss Victoria's guardian never actually gambled at all. Webb simply claimed he did in order to force Victoria into servitude." Theodore Webb looked around frantically, seeing his careful plan crumbling. The marshals were backing away from him, clearly wanting no part of a fraud investigation. "You can't prove," he started. "Actually, we can," came another voice. Victoria spun around to see Clayton Morse riding toward them, battered and bruised but very much not in jail. "Clayton!" Dr. Mitchell exclaimed. "How did you—" "Turns out territorial marshals don't much like being used to enforce fraudulent debts," Morse replied, dismounting carefully. "When they saw the real evidence, they were eager to correct their mistake." He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Theodore Webb, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. The real marshals will be here shortly to transport you to Denver for trial." Theodore Webb made one last desperate play, reaching for his gun. But before he could draw, Daniel's rifle was pointed at his chest. Sheriff Palmer had his weapon ready, and half the men of Silver Creek had him surrounded. "Don't make this worse than it already is," Daniel said quietly. Theodore Webb's shoulders sagged in defeat. The game was over, and he knew it. As the real marshals arrived to take Theodore Webb into custody, Victoria found herself surrounded by the community that had fought so hard to protect her freedom. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, Lucy pressed against her side, and even Clayton Morse managed a smile despite his injuries. "Is it really over?" Victoria asked. Judge Morrison nodded. "The contract was based on fraudulent debts. You're completely free, Miss Victoria. Free to marry Daniel, free to raise Lucy, free to build whatever life you choose." Victoria looked around at the faces of the people who had risked everything to protect her. Former enemies like Clayton Morse, reluctant allies like Sheriff Palmer, and new family like Daniel and Lucy. "I choose this," she said firmly. "I choose all of you." 3 days later, as scheduled, Victoria May walked down the aisle of Silver Creek's little church to marry Daniel Stone. Clayton Morse gave her away, Sheriff Palmer served as best man, and Lucy scattered flower petals with the solemnity of someone who knew she was witnessing something sacred. The woman who had once been sold like cattle was now choosing her own family, her own future, her own life. And in a territory where might usually made right, love had won after all. 10 years later, Victoria Stone stood in the doorway of the Silver Creek schoolhouse, watching her husband Daniel teach a group of children how to shape horseshoe nails at a small forge he'd built for educational purposes. Lucy, now 18 and the town's head teacher, guided the younger students while Daniel demonstrated the ancient craft. The schoolhouse itself was a testament to how much Silver Creek had changed. Built with donations from throughout the territory, it welcomed children of all backgrounds. White settlers, Native American families, former slaves seeking new lives, and the mixed heritage children who represented the territory's evolving future. Victoria's own children played in the yard. Sarah, age 7 and named for Daniel's first wife, and little James, age 4, who had inherited his father's steady hands and his mother's determined spirit. They ran freely among children whose parents once would never have allowed such mixing. "Mrs. Stone," a small voice interrupted her thoughts. "My mama sent this for you." Victoria looked down at Maria Santos, daughter of the Mexican family who had settled in Silver Creek 3 years earlier. The girl held out a beautiful hand-embroidered shawl. "Tell your mother it's lovely," Victoria said, accepting the gift, "and that we're honored she wants to contribute to the church fund." Maria beamed and ran back to join the other children. Victoria wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, marveling at how the simple act of kindness still caught her off guard, even after 10 years of being treated as a valued member of the community rather than discarded property. Clayton Morse approached from across the yard, walking with the slight limp that remained from his arrest that desperate night years ago. He'd never fully recovered from the beating he'd taken while being detained, but he wore his scars as badges of honor, proof that he'd chosen to stand for justice when it mattered most. "Victoria," he greeted her warmly, "beautiful day for the Harvest Festival." "It is," she agreed. "How are the preparations at the ranch?" Morse's ranch had become something unprecedented in the territory, a working partnership between former enemies, where white settlers, reformed outlaws, and displaced tribal members worked side by side. It wasn't always easy, but it was proving that different peoples could build something together if they chose cooperation over conflict. "Everything's ready. The whole territory's talking about our little celebration," Morse said with pride. "They're calling it the Silver Creek Miracle. How a town learned to choose love over fear." Victoria looked out over the bustling schoolyard, where children who shouldn't have mixed were playing together, where parents who should have been enemies were planning a community celebration, where a woman who should have remained property was now helping to shape the future of the entire territory. "Do you ever regret it?" Morse asked quietly. "The choice to stay here, to build this life instead of seeking something easier elsewhere?" Victoria considered the question. She could have left Silver Creek after Theodore Webb's arrest. Daniel would have taken her anywhere she wanted to go, started fresh where no one knew their story. But that would have meant leaving behind the community that had fought for her freedom, abandoning the people who had risked everything to defend a stranger. "Never," she said firmly. "This is where I learned that family isn't about blood or law or property ownership. It's about the people who see you drowning and throw you a rope instead of walking away." Daniel appeared at her side, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection of a decade of marriage. Their love had deepened beyond the desperate romance born of crisis into something steady and sure, built on shared values and mutual respect. "Ready for the festival?" he asked. Victoria nodded, then looked back at the schoolhouse one more time. Above the door hung a simple wooden sign that Lucy had carved. "Silver Creek School, where every child matters." It was a principle that extended far beyond education. In Silver Creek, every person mattered, regardless of their past, their mistakes, or the circumstances that brought them to this place. It was a revolutionary idea in 1870s Wyoming, and it had all started with one man's decision to spend his last dollar to save a stranger. Some stories begin with tragedy and end with triumph. Others start with hatred and conclude with understanding. But the most powerful stories, The ones that echo through generations and change the world begin with a simple choice. The choice to see suffering and respond with compassion. The choice to risk everything for someone who can't save themselves. The choice to believe that every human being deserves dignity, freedom, and love. Daniel Stone made that choice on an auction platform 10 years ago. Victoria made it when she chose to stay and build rather than flee and forget. Their community made it when they stood together against injustice. And because of those choices, Silver Creek became proof that the American frontier could be more than a place where might made right. It could be a place where right made might, where justice triumphed over law when law served cruelty, and where chosen families proved stronger than blood ties built on tradition rather than love. What choice will you make when you see someone who needs saving? If this story moved you, remember that somewhere in your world right now, someone is waiting for their own Daniel Stone. Someone brave enough to risk everything for a stranger's freedom. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the largest changes. Sometimes saving someone else is how we save ourselves. The auction platforms may be gone, but the choice to see each other's humanity remains. What legacy will your choices create?